for attending, Personally Speaking, 2020. This was actually originally set up to be held in March when the convention was going forward in Charlotte. So there have been many changes to this presentation over time. Lucky for me, the book was written, American Cities and the Politics of Political Conventions was written prior to any of this. We actually started writing it in 2012. And so in 2012, maybe even 2011, we started thinking about this book. And when I say we, I've got to introduce my co-authors here. Well, I'll be the lucky one that gets to talk this evening. You have Eric Heberlig, who is a dear colleague of 20 years of mine. And Eric is at UNC Charlotte, but he graduated from Ohio State. I'm not going to tell you the birth year of anyone, but I will just say we're all Generation X. I checked. And Eric studies politics, in particular party politics and interest groups, and has written a couple different books over the years, including doing a Personally Speaking for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, which is great. I am Suzanne Leland. I came to UNC Charlotte in 2001, and the process of the book, I started working in political science and public administration, and I have such great colleagues. And at the time, I was lucky to work with David Swindell, who I'll introduce in a minute. And then also Eric Heberlig. Eric was actually on the committee that hired me at UNC Charlotte, even though he'd been there just not quite a year. So I study, as I mentioned, Eric's our parties and convention person, and I study urban politics and policy and public administration. In particular, I'm interested in city government and how city government markets itself and brands itself. Eric Heberlig, so we've got our politics, he's our politics person. I'm our public administration person. And then we have David Swindell, and I think David is joining us tonight. And David was a colleague of ours at the time at UNC Charlotte. He directed the PhD in Public Policy program. And what was nice about this is that Eric taught a lot of undergraduate political science courses about conventions. And he was able to do a special topics course on conventions. I myself was teaching in the Masters of Public Administration program at the time, and I was teaching classes on public administration, urban politics, and intergovernmental relations, and David was our PhD link. He was teaching PhD students in the PhD program, which is a PhD program in the College of CLAS focusing on public policy. So the three of us came together with our various interdisciplinary backgrounds and started talking about engaging our classes in research projects and engaging our classes in the convention. And so for this reason, we started talking about, well, we ought to do some research since we're going to be doing this. Eric was the co-chair of 49er Democracy at the time, which was leading student participation in the 2012 Charlotte Convention. And he was also directing the Washington Center. So we thought it'd be a unique chance to get our students involved in research, and then maybe later on we could pursue some of the ideas. So once our classes finished during the semester, we started really talking through research ideas, and that's where we came up with the theme of the book. Of course, this isn't done overnight. There's a process. You have to secure a publisher, and you have to write and rewrite a lot. So the book came out in print in 2017, although most of our data and most of the material in the book is surrounding 2012 conventions. We do go back in time in history and talk about conventions from a historical perspective as well. But the primary idea was that, hey, we're experiencing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity here in Charlotte with our students, and let's take advantage of that, and let's really delve into all the different aspects of how you put on a convention. And so we started out going through discussing fundraising, the bidding process, the implementation process, and the economic impact, and then worked on concluding our book with some survey data that we collected right around post-convention time in November. So it's a great opportunity for everyone in this process. We were very excited about the 2020 RNC convention because that was going to give us a lot more opportunities and exposure. And so initially, Eric and I went to Milwaukee. The University of Milwaukee wanted to work with us on a couple projects since the DNC was going to be in Milwaukee. So we did that. And now quite a few things in those past 2 years have changed, including the convention moving to Jacksonville. So when I get towards the end of the presentation, I will start talking and highlighting what is happening with the most recent events and what does it mean for Charlotte. Okay, so just a little bit about myself, and I'm guessing my colleagues Eric and David, although I didn't verify this, I know we all grew up around the same time, and we probably share a lot of very similar memories. And so just giving you a little background on my political memories, one of the first things I remember when I was younger, I was born in Chicago, and Richard J. Daley, the mayor of Chicago, passed away, and I remember everybody talking about it. It was a huge deal, and the funeral and everything was shut down. And so that was my real first political memory. But then I remember, of course, some dark times during the Carter administration. Jimmy Carter became president in 1976. That was the first convention that I can really even think about. And I remember that shortly after the election of Jimmy Carter, we had an energy crisis in this country. And the energy crisis meant that gas prices were increasing greatly and gas was short of supply. You may not have known this, but at the same time, there was also a toilet paper shortage that occurred. And maybe some of you have read about this, but on a late night show, Johnny Carson made a joke about running out of toilet paper. And millions of people went to their stores and purchased toilet paper. What it has to do with the energy crisis, I'm not exactly sure, but there you go. So don't feel bad that if you were on short supply of toilet paper in the last couple of months, because it has happened before in my lifetime. Another very dramatic political memory I have was the hostage situation in Iran. And this got me really interested in the 1980 presidential election between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. And basically, Iran gave an ultimatum and saying that they would not release 50 American hostages unless Jimmy Carter was out of the White House. A lot of people probably don't remember that, but I remember because my family, as well as many other families, watched every night in the news, hoping they would be released. We tied yellow ribbons around our oak trees and sang songs, hoping that they would return. There were 2 women taken, and each of the 2 women were released earlier. And I was lucky enough to see one of the female hostages discuss her experience. And that, I think, really made me want to get involved in politics and really want to understand the issues that I was seeing or hearing. And so I know I asked a lot of questions about, well, why did they take them? Well, where are they? Well, what about their children? How can we get them out? And it was a sad time in American history. Of course, Ronald Reagan won in 1980 in a landslide, and after he won that election, the hostages were released, and the country was very relieved. And then we eventually got to the point where the next presidential election came up, and I was really keen on watching and studying what was going to happen. And so one of my first memories of, I watched both conventions, the Republican National Convention in 1984, and I also watched the Democratic National Convention in 1984. And I remember several distinct highlights, such as seeing a woman VP for the first time, Geraldine Ferraro. That has never happened again. At the time, I remember thinking, well, we'll have a female elected president in no time. We're still waiting. And I also remember Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition, and many of you probably remember Jesse Jackson, and he is still an activist. He's still, still around, but this is the first year he ran for president. I remember that was a pretty historic moment as well. The other unfortunate thing I remember was sitting in class in elementary school, and back then we had these loud PA systems when something bad happened. Usually we were going under our desks for a nuclear war attack, which I'm not sure we would have been saved. But I remember when the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, was shot. And he did recover. But that was a very scary time, I think, for everybody. I remember watching on the news. Everybody was wondering what was going to happen to our country. And as a child who watched too many movies and miniseries about Russia, the Soviet Empire, such as America and The Day After and The Testament, I would look out my window at night and hope that we wouldn't be attacked during the night because the president wasn't there to protect us. So these memories were pretty scary, and I actually told my son, who's 10, about these memories because he has another set of distinct memories going on right now, and he is remembering COVID-19, a world pandemic, and also he is cognizant, or we've talked a little bit about George Floyd, which happened in my hometown of Minneapolis. And so the times are changing. 2020 is a crazy year. You know, we keep thinking 2020 we're going to have something calm down a little bit, but unfortunately, I think my son's going to have a lot of memories like I did, especially during politics. They're just not going to be of Ronald Reagan and his calming, soothing voice. They will be Donald Trump and tweeting constantly. So, okay, so just a little bit about party conventions. When political conventions started in the 1800s and the 1960, the party used the convention to nominate their candidate for President of the United States. This was a long-standing time period and tradition. However, as we moved towards the 1970s and saw political reforms in both parties, then the process changed, and we started to see a nominee emerge much earlier than the convention. Some of this was the pressure of fundraising, and they actually chose their VP prior to the convention. So in the 1970s to the 2010s, while David and Eric and I were all in school and then teaching, we taught about conventions in a way that they didn't matter much. We didn't talk much about them. They were not very interesting, and I never really thought about studying them. And then when Charlotte was going to host the 2012 convention and it really got our attention, we started thinking about it's not really about the nominee. It's really a large commercial or infomercial for the candidates, rallying people to vote in November. And so there's a lot of production going on. And in this process, it means that a city is selected to host the convention. And because the convention brings up to 50,000 people to town, and usually over half of those are members of the media and the world spotlight, given the prominence of news media in this era, we saw conventions really blossom into something like we hadn't seen before. And it was a very open process with lots of participation, but the vote was typically not dramatic. Fast forwarding to 2012, we're entering a new time for conventions. I said the pandemic conventions. I'm hoping there's just one era of pandemic conventions and it'll go away. We'll see what happens. But right now the big concern is, should people come to a large arena? Should we allow 20,000 people to come to an arena, given the increase in cases in COVID-19? And so this has led to much debate back in early March about whether Charlotte was going to remain hosting the convention. And I remember hearing from some folks that said, can Charlotte get out of the contract to host the convention? Charlotte could not get out of the out of the contract, but certainly if the governor or the county health department decided that it would be unsafe for delegates to gather in person in the convention center, then different arrangements would have to be made. So that was in March. And so from March to this afternoon at 4 o'clock, I have been tweaking this presentation and talking to my colleagues about the latest changes in the convention. So it is ever evolving. And so it is an interesting subject to watch. and it is interesting, and the big story is often not inside the convention hall itself or Spectrum Center. It is outside in all the preparation and planning and what goes on around the convention, what money people spend, what parties are held, and which creates a lot of jobs, and mainly temporary jobs in catering and hotel, hospitality industry, event planning. But it is something that cities deem very important to their economic development and often pursue as an economic development strategy. So we decided the best reason to study political nominating conventions was not because we wanted to highlight the drama of who would be nominated for President of the United States and be on the ticket in November, but we wanted to study them because cities were hosting these big events, and they believed there were huge benefits, including economic activity, improving their own infrastructure, public visibility, and branding for the city. These events engage public attention. They create a lot of opportunities for shared experience. They create a new host of volunteers. It takes a lot of people to put on a 4-day convention. And so you maybe I think we had around 7,000 volunteers planned for this upcoming convention in 2020. And I volunteered at the last convention, and that convention, I remember, we probably had around at least 6,000. So there's a lot going on in preparation and the actual hosting activities of the city, which gives the city a sense of civic pride. So I'm highlighting just a couple of these recent conventions. You see, of course, the 2012 Democratic National Convention, but at the same time in 2012, Tampa hosted the Republican National Convention. Then in 2016, we had Cleveland and Philadelphia host conventions. And of course, even my hometown, St. Paul and Minneapolis area, hosted the convention. And these conventions were really different opportunities than they were in the past. So another thing we wanted to understand about conventions in this process was what were some of the risks involved with the city hosting a convention? Did the city have something at stake? Could the city lose something? What were the issues related to disruptions around during the convention time, especially when the Secret Service will come in and close a huge perimeter that the city has no control over, and residents and public transportation systems might be, our people are displaced. So we also wanted to know, a lot of businesses have their employees work from home. Some people simply can't come into work because of the traffic. And you certainly can't fly in and out of the airport during that time because it is so busy with the convention. So we're also interested in understanding conventions from that perspective. And hosting conventions is really complicated. And we realized when we started out, when we started looking at who do we want to interview, who do we want to talk to that would be involved in the Charlotte 2012 convention, we quickly realized that there were a lot of people involved in the convention. And the city was responsible for security measures, which was no small feat in the wake of 9/11. And the security meant that the city had to engage in contracts to bring in other police officers and equipment. And that included for places like Chicago or California. They also had to work with the FBI, FEMA, Secret Service. But coordinating all these efforts was going to be very difficult. In addition to running regular city services, we also had the host committee that was going to have to raise the money to put on the convention. And so there was an active host committee that had a big stake. Although it was a nonprofit organization, they were looking for people and corporations to invest, which also was a big undertaking. For this 2020 convention, the goal was $70 million to be raised. $50 million was already raised and pledged, according to John Lasseter, who is the chair of the host committee. We also know that within the structure, there's really not one leader, and it becomes quite complex. This year, at my last count, there were 23 different security committees alone. So committees total around 80 or 90 different committees. That's not people on the committees. That's the number of committees. So you have a lot of planning going on. The planning for 2020 started in July of 2018. We also know something interesting about conventions, and that is that post 9/11, there is increased media coverage, and the media coverage oftentimes surrounds the potential for terrorism and keeping everybody safe. If you think about who comes to a convention, it is likely going to be a sitting president or a nominee, party nominee that is running for president. But then you also have the vice president coming to town. You have world leaders coming to town, not to mention the thousands and thousands of members of the press. This includes even having TV shows filmed at that location. So in Charlotte, one of the neat things about Charlotte was that we got to host Washington Week on our campus, and we had got to meet and see Gwen Ifill and ask questions, which was fascinating. Others that were lucky got tickets downtown near CPCC to see Jon Stewart and film The Daily Show. So there's a lot of coverage. Of course, all the major networks are in town, and then international networks. Another part of conventions is covering security costs. And up until 2004, security was covered locally, and funds came from the host committee. But after 2004, it became readily apparent in planning the 2012, or planning the convention, the 2004 conventions, especially in New York City and Boston, that the security costs and the level of security would have to increase. So they are national security designated events, so they carry a special designation just like an Olympics or a Super Bowl. And with this comes now a $50 million grant. And the $50 million grant is accepted and used for all of these expenses related to security and keeping the delegates safe, keeping the president or the presidential nominee safe, keeping the delegates, which and might be senators and House of Representative members and so forth, attending. So we've got a target opportunity here for terrorists, and targeting a convention would be one way to get worldwide attention. We also know that there's other security issues that arise during conventions, and we can think back to 1968 when Chicago hosted the Democratic National Convention and there was rioting in the streets. Typically, there's always going to be protesters. There are groups that wait for the very opportunity to come visit your city and try to get as much coverage as they can. There's even someone that comes that started in the 1980 convention for Ronald Reagan to burn the flag and to see how far he can go burning that flag before he gets arrested. And then he may get a windfall, as he did in Cleveland, where he then sues when they try to shut him down for lighting the flag on fire, which is a security hazard, but conflicts with free speech. So he won $200 million, or 200, was it 200 million or 200, a total accumulation from several different events. So he comes to town. Many others do as well, including anarchist groups. And of course, we were expecting lots of groups this year. We had Black Lives Matter come in 2012. They were pretty active. We had some immigration groups that were very active. It was largely peaceful. But given the events in the U.S. Going on right now, with the number of protests and riots over police brutality, we see that it would be a very, very explosive situation when hosting the convention, that there would be different groups. And oftentimes it's outside groups that come in. They don't care what people are writing about. They just want in on the action, which is another kind of disturbing thing. So you have to have the FBI there doing all this background work to get the bad guys, if you will, if something terrible were to happen. So we've got all of these interesting dynamics. In addition, when we think about the city being the focus of the convention, the cities really are the ones that have a lot at stake. And so we looked into why cities would actually bid and host a convention. And of course, this is ever evolving as conventions. We just had a major contract canceled, so that will impact the bidding process. But typically, the modern convention or post 9/11 convention is where a city comes in and signals that they are a world-class city that has all the amenities and ability to host. And they want all of that exposure of the country and the world focused on their city, usually for economic development purposes and branding opportunities. So we studied 132 cities who bid and were invited to bid over a 10-year period, 1992 to 2012. And we looked at basically who the people were who were asked to bid and who were the folks that got the bid at the end of the day. And we learned some really interesting things. One of the things we found out in our analysis was that larger cities with more convention-related assets, such as arenas, not convention centers anymore, but arenas, were with the latest, greatest, and could accommodate, a large number of people, latest, greatest suites and boxes and all the perks. And then cities that were medium-sized cities with active tourism industries that wanted to get folks to come in and actually learn more about their city and an opportunity to brand their city in this process. And they were really likely to be invited for a bid and to submit. The interesting thing is that there was a drop, 10% drop in the bid. And the reason for that is because in bids for party nominating conventions since 9/11 took place. And this is indicating to us that there were probably more risks and heavier disruption costs due to security, that many cities no longer saw the convention as viable. The types of cities we saw start no longer participating in the convention process were very large cities that already had were already branded as world-class cities. So you wouldn't see Los Angeles going for a convention. You wouldn't see New York. You wouldn't see Chicago. Instead, a type of bidder emerged, and that's your Charlotte and Milwaukee type bidders. So the new bidder in the process post 9/11 became smaller cities in need of branding, or in some cases like Pittsburgh, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Cleveland. They're in search of rebranding their city. So when it was announced that Trump may move the convention, and he gave the Governor Cooper a week ultimatum to make a decision on whether he would allow 20,000 people in the arena for his acceptance speech, we had other cities come forward. And these cities, again, it wasn't New York City, it wasn't Chicago, it wasn't Los Angeles. It was actually Jacksonville, Nashville, Savannah, Georgia, which is a very small city, that were mentioned as possible RNC hosts to replace Charlotte. But these are not cities that would typically bid pre-9/11. They would bid post 9/11 because they want the branding opportunity. But the city is making a big risk, and a lot of cities are no longer interested in hosting a convention because the risk is one of unknown. So you start planning 18 months typically ahead of time, and the host committee has to raise millions of dollars to host the convention. And then you actually have the city having to engage in all of these contracts and secure police forces and equipment to come in. They have to make upgrades to facilities, including the arena, typically where the convention is going to be held. They may have to move their central bus transit station like we did in Charlotte in 2012. And in 2004, the Fleet Center in Boston had to try to figure out what to do about the subway that went under the Fleet Center, the boats that could come around it, the planes that could fly overhead, and the highway, interstate highway that ran right through. So now it's all about, trying to be able to have a convention, but have it in one way where the security costs and are going to outweigh the benefits, the economic benefits. And also you want to have, again, you're taking a risk. And it's not just about a risk that might be in the newspaper for a couple days. It's about social media. And now in the social media day and age, starting in 2012, but really 2016 and now 2020, anything can happen anywhere at any time, and groups can organize quickly and mobilize people very quickly, and rumors can spread very quickly. So the unknown is how we can think about the convention and trying to plan a convention in those 18 months. We thought we maybe knew what some of the unknown was. And so actually we know protests can turn into riots. 1968, Chicago, and in St. Paul, Minneapolis was the most recent one. We know that weather can be a threat. Tampa actually had to start their convention later because of a hurricane. And we know that rainstorms, lightning, and so forth may not make venues that are outdoors, like Bank of America Stadium, allow for 60,000 people to come for the acceptance speech. I would also say terrorism has been on the radar, especially since the 2004 conventions, the post 9/11 conventions. But a new unknown that I wouldn't have guessed is a global pandemic, which is something we didn't discuss much in the book. But this just proves our point. There's an unknown out there for every city that decides to host a convention. And the unknown is really unknowable up until really a short time before the convention. We also know that politics plays a role in conventions, and having a Democratic governor for a state that was going to host a Republican national convention appeared to also be a barrier in the case of Charlotte. But typically what we find in a lot of these convention cities is that in the case of the RNC or the DNC, they are held in urban areas. And the urban areas are typically not Republican strongholds. They're typically Democratic strongholds. And this poses additional challenges to the Republican National Convention. So when it came down to bidding, and a lot of people are like, you know, why did Charlotte pursue the convention? Why did Charlotte get the convention? I stand by their decision because I know that, one, we were the only bidder that emerged. And if you know anything about monopolies, we had a chance to really come in with a nice contract, because where else were they going to have it? The next closest host willing was Las Vegas. Imagine your Republican National Convention in Las Vegas. So we know politics plays a really big role in how the convention goes. And it's not really as much about electoral outcomes. There's just a marginal amount that the convention gets people to vote for a particular state. And in fact, when Obama came to town and Charlotte hosted the convention in 2012, Obama did not win the state of North Carolina. So you know it's not an electoral. I think the host committee knows this as well, but oftentimes the party committee is still thinking in terms of that this might make a difference in a purple state, a swing state. So anyways, just, you know, so you can see a few interesting things that occur during a convention. I just didn't know that the standoff would occur at the last week in May. Okay, so a city can do really, really well because if they perform really well, there's not much to do. And this is, of course, a signal that your convention is doing well when people are running videos of cops dancing in the street. A convention, though, could also bring the city negative highlights. And in particular, this is St. Paul, but their RNC convention caused 8.5 hours of rioting and even resulted in the death of a person, and several people were injured and hundreds were arrested. This is not what your city wants to be known for. Your city wants to be known for the cop dancing in the street. So there's a lot at stake. And I'm going to move along quickly now. The city's reputation, there is intense worldwide coverage of the news and social media during the week before the convention and during the 4-day convention period. There's also some short-term economic development gain that a city could see. Lawsuits, as I mentioned, our friend with the flag, and disruption to everyday residents' life, including vulnerable populations such as the homeless that are displaced a lot of times during a convention. City services like public transportation, sanitation, hospitals, airports, uptown businesses or downtown businesses. Even school calendars are often affected. In fact, this time around, Charlotte-Mecklenburg school districts were trying to set school up so in a way that would make it easier to host the convention. UNC Charlotte even moved the start of their semester into September 9th, because of the convention and other related pandemic concerns. So a lot of things can be at stake here. Finally, I wanted to kind of wrap up by mentioning that 2020, when Eric and I visited Milwaukee, Wisconsin, they were kind of hopeful. There was an air of excitement about what the convention was going to bring to the city. And now it's been made possible by the DNC that the convention will largely be online or virtual, depending on the situation with the pandemic. We also know that, unfortunately, Charlotte is no longer hosting the RNC 2020. And Jacksonville, Florida has now replaced Charlotte and will be hosting the majority of events, including the president's acceptance speech. And what does it mean for Charlotte? Well, this is where we're at right now. Trump keeps tweeting. When this tweet came out, I nearly had a heart attack. And a lot of other people who had way more at stake than someone that studies conventions, did. But again, Trump said they were forced to seek another state to host the 2020 RNC convention, and he gave Governor Cooper a week to guarantee that the delegates could be present in person in the Spectrum Center. Now, what does this mean? We'll probably get into this with the questions and answers, but a quick summary of it is 330 delegates are going to come to town over the weekend, mainly the first day of the convention. So it's now down to one official day, although there may be some meetings on the weekend. The $50 million Department of Justice grant was received by the city of Charlotte, and they have spent about $14 million of that grant already. The local economy had an estimated $150 million of expected economic activity. I say estimated. There's a lot of debate about these numbers. It's not exactly a science to the amount. Numerous contracts are going to be breached, and John Lasseter, the host of the Charlotte RNC committee, said he had a stack of contracts that were going to be breached in the process. And then, is there going to be some long-lasting damage to Charlotte's reputation as a city? Because the convention was pulled. So there are a lot of things out there right now that we just don't really know. Whoops. Okay, so Eric and I were planning to do a study and an experiment in July about the convention and COVID-19. However, we had to hasten that experiment, in about 24 hours write a new one, and launch that experiment by May 29th in case Trump were to tweet. Now, lucky for us, he got into it with some social media outlets during that time, and his focus shifted away from the convention. So we had enough time to field a survey of 1,002 respondents nationwide. And I'm not going to go into all the details of what we did in that experiment. That's another follow-up conversation. But let's just say that the convention, we asked people to assess the statement, the convention should be held as a traditional rally with 20,000 people in an arena. Only 12% of Democrats approved, 14% of independents approved, and 45% of Republicans approved. You can see how this is falling down party lines. And overall, for the entire sample, 24% of the people approved, either strongly or somewhat approved of hosting a convention that will be held traditionally with 20,000 people in an arena. So what do we expect in 2024? Well, we always have the unknown, which we can't predict, which we've learned the hard way. We do expect that there's going to be fewer bidders for either the RNC or DNC, especially if you see that a city's contract is breached, and it depends a lot on how that's going to be resolved. The convention will likely be shorter. In fact, there have been calls, some interesting opinion pieces about eliminating the convention. And the convention will also probably have a virtual component to it, no matter what comes about in 2024. So we'll wait another couple years and we'll see how many bidders emerge. But I expect the trend in bidding to again be fewer bidders, more Jacksonville's, Savannah, Georgia's, Nashville's will be in the mix. Okay, so there's a lot of material. The book has a lot more detail in it, and a lot of this information is even fairly new to me. But we'll go ahead and take questions. I want to say that David Swindell from Arizona State University is on Zoom and is available for questions. And Eric Heverlig is available. He's sitting in the room with me, 6 feet away at least, Martha Croft. And he is available to answer questions as well as myself.
So we do have, I'm Lynn Robertson with the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and we do have a few questions that have come in. We've got about 25 minutes for questions, so we'll move right along through these. So one of the questions we've had is, what is the evidence that exists that conventions deliver on the economic and the branding promises? Beyond the few days of conventions, what are the sustained impacts? And we'll toss it out to the two of you in the room, and then.
Well, the estimates that cities typically put out, you can take with a grain of salt, because of course they have an incentive to inflate the value. But there is good evidence that the conventions do bring in quite a bit of direct spending. It's really the amount of impact that's in question. I think the larger point for cities when they're trying to decide this is that you're also giving up economic activity that would be happening anyway. So it's what's the trade-off for you? So for a city like Charlotte that doesn't have a large tourism sector to begin with, those hotels aren't going to be full on a typical week in August. So bringing in a convention is bringing in money to a city like Charlotte. for a city like Orlando or Las Vegas, that does have a big tourism industry, it's a much bigger risk for them because they can fill their hotels without giving discounted rates to the political parties. So, like many questions in social science, the answer is, well, it depends.
And on the second half of that question, talking about sustained impact, how does that tie in with the branding impact? And then maybe bridging into what is going to be the impact on Charlotte from the standpoint of now suddenly we are not going to have that bump on the brand and potentially even be hurt by this. So what kind of negative impact that's of a sustained impact might there be? And how are we going to be able to observe that?
Well, I think a lot of the negative impact is going to come to the businesses that have been hit the hardest already by COVID-19. The restaurants, the catering, the hotel business, the airline, in particular American Airlines, which has a hub in Charlotte. These are going to be some things that are going to be costs that are hard to overcome. Charlotte has raised and pledged the host committee to raise $70 million for approximately 1,200 events that were going to happen around the region. And of course, those events will now be canceled or moved to Jacksonville. And so that's going to have short-term a pretty big effect, I think, on the hospitality industry. You can think about it, every state delegation has a party. Every state delegation stays in their tries to stay in their own hotel. And the state parties are not sitting in a pub in the back room. They're big productions at places like the Music Factory. So that is going to be quite a loss. As for Charlotte, I think we were lucky with 2012. The goal was really to get the Charlotte name out there and the brand. And so we did have an opportunity to do that, and I think we did that very successfully. It's quite hard to measure, but a lot of people just want to be able to say Charlotte and not have to add North Carolina on the end. And I think we saw that happening. So probably there was not as much to gain for the branding in this particular convention because of 2012. So we're lucky in that respect. If it happened to a first-time host, that would be much more difficult.
So John Lasseter is being quoted in the media as saying we have some we've negotiated our contracts correctly on the front end of this. So we think, at least from a financial standpoint, we're going to come out, okay with that. In light of what's happened, that we're right on the brink of having the convention, it's moving. What impact do you anticipate that'll have on how cities go about negotiating if they want to be a host city? I mean, what different factors are they going to think about now?
So most of the convention contracts did not have an act of God clause in them. I would bet that the new ones will. And in fact, this one did not have an act of God clause, meaning that if something disastrous were to happen, nobody would be, held to their obligation. So Charlotte really couldn't cancel the convention. They needed to stay strong and have their obligations ready. So it was really the RNC that went back on the deal. So we'll have to see how that's handled. I know with the $14 million, likely either in 2020 or 2024, when the next Democrat is elected, that might get reimbursed. I think it's going to have to be a political fight there, and I really don't know in terms of how much of the $50 million for the host committee was pledged, but I'm sure they spent a lot of money securing those venues and putting deposits down.
I think we're going to see a big drop in bids in 2014. I wouldn't be surprised if cities just say, no, we're not going to do this. We saw big drops in convention bids after 9/11, cities saying, well, it's not worth the risks and the disruptions. And then you add this on top of it. If parties can walk away and say, we're going virtual or we're moving somewhere else, for the reasons you talked about in the previous question, why lose that money? Why lose the opportunity costs of getting your name and your branding out there and getting nothing out of it? Susie mentioned the debacle that the Democrats had in the 1968 Chicago convention. That's legendary among people who follow politics, and that's, 2 generations ago. This Charlotte's experience and Milwaukee's experience this year is going to have that same type of effect on cities, that they're going to say, why put the time and effort into this if we get marginal benefit out of it and the parties can, walk away later. So I wouldn't be surprised if these are the last traditional conventions we see.
So maybe talk about that a little bit more from the standpoint of, now we have COVID-19. We also have the impact of social media growing, and the news was announced on Twitter. That was when people first heard that this was very likely going to happen. What do you feel as social scientists that you're potentially seeing happening in the change? I mean, you had 3 different eras that you talked about in one of your slides, Suzanne. What's going to be the next era potentially out of all of this? Like, what will a convention look like potentially, and what will people be assessing in their planning?
Well, delegates will still have to cast their votes for the presidential nominee, but how the Democratic National Convention already agreed that these don't have to be in person. So I don't know, the Republicans have not made it a decision on that at all. I don't think they're going to. So each party could wind up being different, but definitely I can see putting less and less money into the political convention process. And what happens if nobody bids on the convention?
Yeah, I think the parties still have an incentive to push for traditional conventions. They get their official business meeting out of it. They nominate their candidates. They approve their platform. They get this big infomercial out of it to get free advertising to the public. And the city raises the money to pay for it. So it's in the party's perspective to have these. What's going to change is that it's no longer in the city's incentive to raise all this money for the parties and then have the rug yanked out from under them at the very last minute. So I think the ball is really in the city's court, and I think the city's reactions are going to be largely driven by the success of the Democrats' virtual convention. If the Democrats' virtual convention goes well, that's going to be the new model for doing this, and the cities aren't going to have much interest in bidding, and certainly are going to use their lack of interest as leverage to say, no, we're not plunking down $70 million anymore to throw a party for you guys.
So in the city's risk assessment, they may determine that the risk is too great, so the power dynamic potentially is shifting, possibly out of what we're seeing happen during these 2 conventions?
Certainly.
Yeah.
I would think the power dynamic, the cities would have more power. They already were becoming in a more powerful position in the negotiating process as there were fewer and fewer. But again, the contracts will look very different in the future, and I think, again, that clause will be in there. There'll probably be a lot of additional language in the contracts about if something happens and the convention is canceled, what does the host committee receive? What does the city receive? What happens to the the Department of Justice $50 million? And, I think, one of the things that happened in Charlotte in 2012 is they actually shrunk the number of days of the convention. And so they were already kind of looking at shrinking the amount of time. I think they'll still always want to have that nomination process where and an acceptance speech from the party's candidate. I think that will probably be pretty important still. What form that takes, I mean, it could just be on television.
So we've talked about institutions. Now let's talk about individuals. There have been a few people who've been sort of front and center throughout this process. Mayor Vi Lyles comes to mind, members of the city council, the governor. Are there things from the standpoint of potentially the impact on them politically, on them as leaders within our state and our city? What's the impact on their brands?
Yeah, certainly, although we know that mayors, one of the things I didn't bring up that we talk about in the book is that mayors, while they might be more ambitious after hosting a convention, they're no more likely to win office than they would without hosting a convention. So that's will play a factor. I think when you look at the numbers that we showed you nationwide, I would be interested in seeing Charlotte numbers, but I think that a lot of people in Charlotte believe that it would be a good idea to cancel the convention and not hold the convention at this current time. So I think there's a lot of relief, and I think that will also play into the election.
I think it depends who people credit or blame.
Mm-hmm.
I think Mayor Lyles wasn't in the Twitter war. It was between Governor Cooper and President Trump. So I don't, even people in the hotel or restaurant industry here in Charlotte who might be angry that the convention was canceled, they're not going to hold her responsible because it wasn't her decision. But I think based on the evidence we have in our book that this is really off the radar screen for most people. It doesn't directly affect them. So I think the way it could play a role this year is it more fits in the broader narrative of how people assess the governor and the president's balance between reopening the economy versus protecting public health. And this is just one piece of evidence that's going to fit into that broader theme of do they agree with the president or the governor on those? So I'm skeptical that this is going to have much of an impact on either of them directly.
So you both are, or all three of you, the three co-authors are researchers as well as engaged with the community in your research. You're also teachers. So what lessons, kind of as maybe some closeout comments, and I don't know how we get Dr. Swindell involved in answering this question, but what learnings from all of this that's going on? I mean, what do you try to impart to students who are in your classes as they look at this broad landscape of how political parties select, and now we have all these other dynamics going on?
Well, I think it fits in with the theme of the entire last semester, which is be adaptable. Life throws you curveballs. So, the more prepared you are, the broader your range of skills are, the better capacity you have for dealing with the uncertainties of life. Yeah, and I think, throughout the book, what we documented is what the cities and parties have adapted institutions like conventions over time, and there's this, constant interaction, and what we're seeing this year is just a much more obvious example of that need to mutually innovate and accommodate, to meet the demands of the situation.
Mm-hmm. For me personally, my spring course on intergovernmental relations was set up to study the implementation challenges and communication challenges of hosting the convention. And so we were planning on having some guest speakers and folks coming in, and then my students were going to do a project looking at some of the intergovernmental aspects of the committee structures and communications. That was a pretty big disappointment. I think a lot of the students were disappointed. The class I had last summer did a project in conjunction with the FBI on looking at social media and previous conventions and what were the hot button issues that we might expect in Charlotte. And I know that they really enjoyed that project and got a lot out of it. So that's disappointing. And then I think Eric can speak to the fact that the Washington Center program was canceled.
So I'm going to direct this same question to Dr. Swindell, and then we also have another question that's come in, and we do have room, we have enough time to address this question. Dr. Swindell, if you'd like to come in, I think you're unmuted, so I'm curious how you're taking some of these learnings back into your classroom and your work with students in the community where you are.
Well, ever since we started working on the book, I've used this as a really interesting case study to illustrate several different points. And I think Suzanne and Eric have both highlighted several of those points already, both in terms of the economic impact. How do we measure economic impact? What are the long-term implications of this? What's the value of reputation for a community like Charlotte, or any community for that matter? As well as how do you put together the kinds of protections in place for your community as a public manager trying to meet the political demands of elected officials, at the same time making sure that you're protecting the taxpayers' investment through through the taxes that they're paying to host something like this. So I think there's a lot of really good lessons that these provide us for our students in public affairs. Though I think the biggest takeaway that going forward does tie into, I think, what Eric kind of alluded to, is that you got to be ready to pivot. It's a lesson that we highlight a lot in our capstone projects, things of that nature, but this is obviously one that's a very large scale pivot having to deal with a situation, not just the virus itself, but the response to the virus. And how does, if you look at this as an intergovernmental relations situation, how does the local government engage in and again, that protective role of taxpayers when in fact you have this larger scale political tug of war going on at a level that really you don't have any control over as a local official?
Interesting. Thank you. And it's not exactly the same light, but a final question that we'll take. We have time for this last question, which is that a lot of cities potentially passed on the RNC due to the perception that hate crimes, or the reality, one or the other, that hate crimes increased in places where Trump had held campaign rallies in 2016. Was that a factor in cities choosing to not bid for the convention? And then also, did the DNC have a similar small number of bids? Is there any kind of correlation there that you saw in your research?
Well, the DNC actually had more bidders, and it came down to Houston, Miami, and Milwaukee, so they had 3 very serious finalists. So I think it did play a role because, again, Charlotte was the only one left in the process. And I think that there is a lot of concern about protests and riots. And I think that Donald Trump is very different than most of our modern presidents in many ways, and he speaks to people using social media directly, and we haven't seen that before. So that also introduces some other complications. So what if something at the host committee when you're putting on the convention happens and he's not happy about it? How will that be reflected in his Twitter account.
So I'm gonna mute my mic and turn it back over to Suzanne just for closing words or sending us on our way.
Yeah, I just want to give Eric and David a real quick chance if they have any final words of wisdom.
I don't. Go ahead, David.
My students would argue that I haven't given any words of wisdom for quite some time, so why start now? But no, I really think you did a lovely job, Suzanne and Eric, both hitting so many of the highlights that of what we've done, but also how it applies to the current situation that is probably opening. I agree with you all that I think we're opening a fourth age, if you will, of political conventions, and it's going to look very different going forward because of what we're going to learn from how we deal with this situation. It's going to set a new model.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I really appreciate everyone coming out and attending, not physically coming out, but virtually, which is now what we're all going to be doing and have been doing since March. This is the first time I had to, other than teaching my classes, participate in this process. And I really wanted to thank some folks at UNC Charlotte that put this on and helped make this happen. Of course, the dean of our college, Nancy Gutierrez, was integral in helping us reschedule this event and then do it virtually. And Lynn Robeson, who is here to ask the questions, which is awesome. She does a lot of PR for our college and has really helped a lot in getting us helped me get into the building today, which is closed. So I really appreciate that. Susan Jatan is also here, and Susan did a great job of talking me through the event planning and setting everything up for this tonight. And then I have a couple other folks in the audience here that helped me with the technical issues. Originally, we had talked about me doing a YouTube video, and I was terrified. I'd never done a YouTube video. My son had done several. He said he would produce it for me. I wasn't sure if that was what our audience would be looking for. So I am really thankful we got to do this evening. Thank you all.